I was sitting in that courtroom, hands locked in my lap, heart pounding like a drum in my throat. When Jason stood up, he adjusted his tie like he was preparing for a job interview, not fighting for custody of our daughter. He didn't even glance in my direction. His eyes were fixed on the judge, unwavering and certain. "Your Honor, she's unfit," he declared, his voice smooth and unwavering. "Even her own family won't speak to her. They've cut her off completely." His lawyer, Mr. Bowen, nodded in sync, as if this script had been rehearsed over morning coffee. My breath caught in my chest, and I felt the weight of every stare in that room pressing down on me. Unfit. Abandoned. Those words weren't just lies, they were weapons. And Jason wielded them like he always had, calm, composed, calculated. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that it was his manipulation that drove my family away. That his constant whispers, his sly remarks, had isolated me from everyone who ever cared. But the words wouldn't come. I glanced to my side where my daughter Ella sat in a wooden chair far too big for her small frame. Her legs swung above the floor, and she clutched her little blue backpack like it was the only safe place in the room. Her dark curls framed her face, and she picked at the rubber strap of her watch the way she always did when she was nervous. When Jason spoke those words, when he twisted reality into something unrecognizable, Ella turned and looked up at me. Her eyes weren't scared. They were steady, calm, as if she was anchoring me when I couldn't anchor myself. And then, without a word, she stood up. In that silent, tension-soaked room, my daughter, my sweet, brave girl, stood up like she had every right to be heard. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her little journal, the one covered in stars and stickers, the one I thought she only used to draw pictures of cats and scribble spelling words. "Your Honor," she said, her voice small but clear, "I'd like to read from my notebook." The room went still. I swear I could hear the clock ticking above the judge's head. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "Go ahead," he said gently. Ella looked straight at Jason, then at me. She opened her journal and started to read. Her voice, tiny but resolute, filled the courtroom with memories she had kept hidden. She spoke of the nights he slammed doors and punched walls when he thought no one was watching. She told of the time he yelled at our dog so loudly it wouldn't come out from under the bed for days. She shared how he would whisper cruel things when I wasn't home, how he'd tell her not to tell me about the bottles hidden under the sink, or the words he used when I wasn't around. She read it all without stuttering, without pausing, as if she had practiced these words 100 times in her mind. When she finished, the room was silent. Even Judge Whitmore looked shaken. That was the moment everything changed. Not when Jason lied, not when his lawyer nodded like it was all predetermined, but when an 8-year-old girl stood up, looked the court in the eye, and told the truth that no one else had dared to say. People think leaving is the hard part. It isn't. It's what comes after, the silence, the guilt, the second-guessing. That's the part no one warns you about. End of part 1. Midnight. The weeks after the hearing felt like walking on a tightrope. I moved through the days cautiously, afraid of every shadow, every unexpected knock on the door. Jason wasn't finished. I knew him well enough to understand that. His pride had taken a blow, and he'd never let that go unanswered. But for once, I didn't feel alone. Ella had opened a door I never realized was there. She had spoken her truth in front of strangers, and in that moment, she'd handed me back my strength. I clung to it fiercely. My lawyer, Ms. Lane, was relentless. She gathered everything: police records, medical reports, even neighbors' statements of the nights they'd heard shouting echoing through the walls. She wanted me to be prepared for whatever Jason planned next. Meanwhile, I kept Ella close. We painted her room in soft lavender, her favorite color, and filled it with books and stuffed animals. I wanted her to feel safe, cocooned in a world where Jason's voice couldn't reach. She seemed lighter, more at ease, but there were still moments when she'd flinch at loud noises or go silent when the phone rang. One afternoon, while I was sorting through old boxes, Ella came running into the room, clutching her journal to her chest. "I want to write more," she said, eyes bright with determination. I smiled and nodded, handing her a pen. Write whatever you want, sweetie. It's yours. And she did. Every day after school, she would curl up in her little reading nook and write. Some days she wrote about her friends and school, but sometimes she wrote about Jason, about how he made her feel small, how she hated the smell of his cologne because it always meant he was angry. I didn't read it, but I knew. I knew because she started smiling more, laughing freely, like the words she put on those pages pulled the weight off her little shoulders. It was just the beginning of something we couldn't yet understand. The weeks after the hearing felt like walking a tightrope, every step cautious, every breath measured. I moved through the days bracing for impact, convinced that at any moment Jason would strike back. I knew him well enough to understand that his pride had taken a blow in that courtroom, and he wouldn't let that go unanswered. His eyes, the way they burned with quiet rage as Ella read from her notebook, were seared into my mind. But for once, I didn't feel alone. Ella had done something I never thought possible. She'd spoken her truth in front of strangers, and in doing so, she handed me back a piece of my strength. I clung to it fiercely, using it to rebuild the cracks he had carved into my life. My lawyer, Ms. Lane, was relentless. She gathered everything: police reports, medical records, even statements from neighbors who had heard the shouting that used to echo through our walls. She wanted me to be ready, to be prepared for whatever Jason planned next. Meanwhile, I kept Ella close. I painted her room in soft lavender, her favorite color, and filled it with stuffed animals and stacks of books. I wanted her to feel safe, cocooned in a world where Jason's voice couldn't reach. She seemed lighter, more at ease. But there were still moments when she'd flinch at loud noises or go silent when the phone rang. I'd watch her then, my heart aching for the childhood she was forced to outgrow. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, Ella came running into the room, her journal clutched tightly to her chest. "I want to write more," she announced, eyes bright with determination. I smiled and handed her a pen. "Write whatever you want, sweetie. It's yours." She looked at the pen as if it held all the power in the world, then hurried off to her reading nook. Every day after school, she would curl up in that corner and scribble away. Sometimes she wrote about school or her friends, but other times she wrote about Jason, how his voice got sharp like broken glass when he was angry, how the smell of his cologne made her stomach twist because it always seemed to follow his temper. I didn't read it, but I knew. I knew because she began to smile more, to laugh freely, like the weight on her small shoulders was being lifted one word at a time. It was the start of something I couldn't yet understand. Her journal became her sanctuary, a place where she could say the things she couldn't speak aloud. And every night she would tuck it back under her pillow before climbing into bed, hugging it close like it held her dreams. Weeks turned into months, and for the first time in years, our lives found a rhythm. We went to school, we came home, we read stories at night. I taught her how to bake chocolate chip cookies, the ones my mother used to make before Jason made her believe I wasn't worth loving. She giggled when flour dusted her nose, her eyes bright and unburdened. I took pictures of those moments. Hundreds of them. Her laughing at the kitchen counter, flour on her cheeks. Her sprawled out on the living room floor, coloring in princesses and superheroes with wild strokes of purple and blue. Her standing in front of the little house we'd managed to make a home, her hand gripping mine, her smile unrestrained. I wanted to capture it all, evidence that she was happy, that she was growing, that she was safe. But even as I savored those moments, I could feel Jason's shadow looming, just beyond reach but never far enough away. He wasn't done with us. I knew that. Ms. Lane knew that. And deep down, I think Ella knew that too. Then, just as the leaves began to turn orange and red, the summons arrived. Came in a crisp white envelope with Jason's lawyer's name printed at the top, heavy with implication. A review hearing. Ms. Lane called it a formality, just Jason trying to keep his claws in, trying to regain the control he'd lost. But I knew better. Jason didn't do anything halfway. He played to win. That night, as I tucked Ella into bed, she looked up at me with those steady, unflinching eyes of hers. "Are we going back to the courtroom?" she asked, her voice soft but certain. I swallowed hard, brushing a curl away from her face. "Yes, baby. We are." I tried to smile, but it wavered. She saw right through it. "Do I have to read again?" she whispered, her hands clutching the edges of her blanket. My heart squeezed tight in my chest. "Only if you want to," I replied. "You were so brave last time. I don't want you to feel like you have to do that again." Ella looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing patterns in the blanket. "I want to," she said finally, her voice firm. "If they don't believe you, they'll believe me. They have to." I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight. "I'm so proud of you, Ella. You are the bravest person I know." She pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes. "We're gonna win, right, Mom?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. I didn't know how to answer that, not truthfully. But I held her hand and squeezed it gently. "We're gonna try our very best." As she drifted off to sleep, I stayed beside her, my fingers tracing the edge of her journal tucked beneath her pillow. I knew that whatever happened next, whatever Jason tried to throw at us, I would be ready. And I knew she would be too. I would protect her this time. I would make sure she never had to pick up the pieces of my shattered heart again. The day of the custody review hearing arrived like the weight of a coming storm, thick with tension and anticipation. I dressed Ella in her favorite yellow dress, the one with daisies stitched along the hem. She twirled in the living room, giggling as the skirt flared around her ankles. For a moment, the tension broke, and I laughed with her, the sound foreign but desperately needed. We drove in silence to the courthouse, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. Ella sat in the back seat, her hands folded neatly over her journal. She watched the scenery pass by with wide eyes, her gaze flickering to me in the rearview mirror every few minutes. I gave her small smiles, but my stomach felt like it was in knots, twisted and stretched to its breaking point. When we arrived, the courthouse loomed large and imposing, its stone columns stretching up towards a gray, cloud-cluttered sky. I took Ella's hand as we walked up the steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. Jason was already inside, flanked by his lawyer, Mr. Bowen. They stood near the entrance, talking in hushed tones, their expressions sharp and focused. He caught my eye and smirked, as if this were some game he was destined to win. I squeezed Ella's hand tighter, pulling her closer to my side. Inside, the walls felt too close, the ceilings too high. We found our seats, and I caught sight of Ms. Lane at the front, her briefcase already open, files stacked neatly in front of her. She gave me a reassuring nod, mouthing the words, "We've got this." I wanted to believe her. I needed to. Jason took the stand first, his voice smooth and polished. He painted a picture of stability and concern, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his gaze steady and unwavering. He spoke about his steady job, his well-kept house, his involvement in Ella's schooling. He described me as unstable, unreliable, emotionally unfit to care for a child. His voice didn't crack. His eyes didn't flinch. He made it all sound so reasonable, so carefully curated to fit his narrative. I felt my hands clench into fists, my nails biting into my palms. It was like watching him build a wall, brick by brick, to shut me out of my own life. My breath came shallow, each inhale feeling like a struggle. I glanced at Ella. She was watching him with a steady gaze, her face expressionless, her hands folded neatly over her journal. When it was our turn, Ms. Lane stood up with a calmness that I envied. She approached the bench, her voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my client to the stand," she announced. My heart lurched. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't prepared to speak. I looked at Ms. Lane wide-eyed, but she gave me a small, encouraging nod. "You can do this," she mouthed. I stood up, my knees feeling like water beneath me, and walked to the stand. The wooden chair creaked beneath my weight as I sat down, and I folded my hands in my lap to stop them from shaking. Ms. Lane approached, her expression softening. "Can you tell us about Ella?" she asked. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "She's my world," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I've done, every decision I've made since leaving Jason was for her. To keep her safe. To give her a chance to grow up without fear." My hands trembled slightly and I clasped them tighter together. Has there been fear? Ms. Lane pressed gently. I nodded, my eyes dropping to my lap. Yes, I whispered. There was always fear. He knew how to control it. He knew how to make me feel small, how to make me feel like I was losing my mind. And when I left, he made sure I felt like I was the one who was broken. Ms. Lane's voice softened. Why did you stay? Question hit me hard, sharper than I'd expected. I blinked back tears, inhaling slowly. Because I thought I could change it. I thought if I just loved him enough, if I tried hard enough, things would be different. But it never changed. It only got worse. I saw Jason shift in his seat, his jaw tightening, but I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Ms. Lane turned to the judge. Your Honor, with your permission, we'd like Ella to speak. My heart dropped. I glanced back at Ella, her hands still neatly folded over her journal. She met my eyes and nodded just once. Teddy. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I nodded back. She was ready. The judge, looking down at his papers, gave a small nod. The child may speak. Ella rose from her seat, her little hands still clutching her journal. She walked to the front with her chin held high, climbing into the witness chair that seemed far too big for her small frame. She set her journal on her lap and looked up at the judge with unblinking eyes. Do you want to read from that again? Ms. Lane asked gently. Ella nodded. Yes, please. She opened the journal, her fingers sliding over the pages with practiced care. When she found the right spot, she took a deep breath and began to read. Her voice was soft but clear, echoing through the room with quiet strength. She read about the night she spent listening to shouting from behind closed doors, about the moment she hid in her room when she heard glass shatter. She read about the things Jason said when he thought no one else could hear, the names he called me, the words that twisted like blades. I watched Jason's expression shift, his shoulders stiffening, his eyes narrowing. But he didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. When Ella finished, the room was silent. Her eyes found mine, and I felt my heart swell with something I couldn't name. Pride. Relief. Love. Thank you, Ella, Ms. Lane said, her voice cracking just slightly. Ella climbed down from the chair, her journal hugged tightly to her chest, and walked back to me. I pulled her close, pressing my cheek against her curls. The judge cleared his throat. I think I've heard enough for today, he said. His voice was soft, almost thoughtful. We will reconvene in 2 weeks. Jason stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyer scrambling after him, but I didn't watch him leave. I held Ella tight, my arms wrapped around her, and for the first time I didn't feel afraid. Not anymore. 2 weeks between the hearing and the final ruling felt like an eternity. I kept busy, mostly for Ella's sake. We baked cookies, painted her room a brighter shade of lavender, and spent hours at the park, pushing her on the swings until her laughter soared above the rustling leaves. I wanted to fill every minute with joy, every second with normalcy, because I knew Jason wasn't done. Not yet. Ms. Lane called me 3 days before the hearing. Her voice was steady but laced with urgency. He's filed an emergency appeal, she told me. I wasn't surprised. Jason never let anything go. But I'm not worried, she continued. We have enough evidence. More than enough. I wished I could share her confidence, but my hands still shook when I hung up the phone. The night before the hearing, Ella came into my room with her journal pressed to her chest. Can I read again tomorrow? She asked. I stared at her, my heart squeezing painfully. I had wanted to protect her from this, to shield her from the ugliness that lingered between Jason and me. But Ella, she had a strength I never realized. Quiet, unyielding strength. I nodded, brushing her curls back from her forehead. If you want a sweetheart. She smiled, the kind that made her eyes sparkle, and crawled into bed with me, curling up against my side. I wrapped my arm around her and we fell asleep like that, tangled up in warmth and safety. The morning of the hearing was cold and gray. Fog clung to the ground like ghosts that refused to let go. We walked up the steps of the courthouse hand in hand, Ella's tiny fingers wrapped around mine. Jason was already there, pacing back and forth with Mr. Bowen by his side. He didn't look up as we passed, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Inside, the room felt even smaller than I remembered. Wooden benches stretched out in rigid rows, and the ceiling seemed to press down, heavy with judgment. Ms. Lane was waiting for us, a small stack of papers in her hands. She smiled when she saw us, bending down to hug Ella tightly. "You ready, kiddo?" she asked. Ella nodded, her grip tightening on her journal. The judge arrived promptly, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and called the court to order. Jason's lawyer, Mr. Bowen, started first. He droned on about stability and financial security, about how Jason provided the perfect environment for a child to thrive. He painted me as reckless, unsteady, prone to emotional outbursts. I sat silently, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. Ella watched with that same steady gaze, her journal balanced on her knees. When it was Ms. Lane's turn, she rose calmly, her voice sharp and clear. "Your Honor, we would like to call Ella to speak." My breath caught, but I didn't object. Ella stood up, walked to the front of the room with her chin held high, and climbed into the chair. Her feet dangled above the floor, swinging slightly as she settled the journal in her lap. "Ella," Ms. Lane began, her voice softening. "Would you like to read from your journal?" Ella nodded, flipping to a page with the corner folded down. She took a breath, looked at the judge, and began to read. Her voice was soft but unwavering, each word clear and sharp. She spoke of the night she hid under her bed when Jason slammed doors and cursed under his breath. She read about the time he yelled so loudly that the neighbors knocked on the door, only for him to send them away with a smile and a lie. My hand shook as she read, but I kept my gaze fixed on her. I wouldn't look at Jason. I couldn't. Not while Ella was speaking her truth. I saw Ms. Lane's hands tighten on the edge of the table, her eyes wet but determined. When Ella finished, the room was silent. Not a whisper, not a breath. She closed her journal, placed her hands neatly in her lap, and looked directly at the judge. "I want to stay with my mom," she said, her voice steady. "She makes me feel safe." Judge Whitmore watched her for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful. Then he turned to Jason. "Mr. Bowen, do you have any questions for the witness?" Jason leaned over, whispering furiously to his lawyer. Mr. Bowen cleared his throat, stood up, and shook his head. "No, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore nodded, turning back to Ella. "Thank you, Ella. You may return to your seat." Ella slid off the chair and walked back to me. I pulled her close, my hand cupping the back of her head, and she leaned into me, her tiny frame soft and warm against my side. The judge looked down at his notes, flipping through pages with a methodical precision. I held my breath, squeezing Ella's hand so tightly I worried I might hurt her. But she didn't flinch. She held on right back. Through what felt like an eternity, Judge Whitmore looked up. His eyes met mine, then flicked to Ella, then back again. "In my 25 years on this bench," he began, his voice even and deliberate, "I have seen many testimonies, but few have been as sincere and unwavering as what I witnessed today." He paused, glancing at Jason, whose face had gone rigid, his fists clenched against the table. "I am granting full custody to Ms. Raines, effective immediately. Any visitation from Mr. Raines will be supervised, pending further investigation." The words crashed over me like a wave, strong and unyielding. My breath left me in a rush, and I squeezed Ella so tightly she squeaked in surprise. I released her just enough to see her face, her eyes shining with disbelief. "We did it, baby," I whispered, my voice cracking. "We did it." Jason stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He stormed out of the room, Mr. Bowen scrambling after him. I didn't watch him go. I didn't care anymore. He was a shadow that no longer held weight in my life. We walked out of that courthouse into the crisp autumn air, the sunlight warming our faces. Ella held my hand, her journal tucked under her arm, and for the first time I felt free. Truly, completely free. As we walked down the steps, Ella looked up at me, her eyes bright and unburdened. "Are we going home?" she asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling with relief. "We're going home." If this story moved you, please consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and leaving a comment below. Your words matter more than you know. And if you want more real stories of courage, survival, and truth, subscribe to the channel. We're building something real here, one story at a time. Thank you for watching.